I was born in South Korea in October 1960. I was a twin. I was adopted with my twin brother. We were in an orphanage for the first 8 months of our lives. Our parents actually adopted us very shortly after birth, but we were very, very ill. And so we were kept in the orphanage for 8 months because in those days, the trip from Seoul to the United States was very long. You had to change planes in Tokyo and Anchorage. It was really essentially a 2-day trip. So we weren't well enough to travel. And actually, we were malnourished in the orphanage, and we came over with a lot of illness. We were told that our birth mother died in childbirth. I have no real information, and that could be true and it could be not true. We don't have any information about our birth father. My papers indicate that I am a Park. That Park is my Korean name. And I believe that that's correct. So we actually flew out of Seoul. We were in an orphanage in Seoul. We were adopted through the government agency at the time that no longer exists. The orphanage no longer exists. And we flew out in June of 1961 when we were 8 months old. We were very, very small. We were less than 10 pounds at the time that we came over. And our mother had bought those onesies with the feet, and she had gotten them for 10-month size just in case. But we were so small that the feet hung down by feet, literally. I mean, we were tiny in our outfit. So we flew into Midway Airport. O'Hare didn't actually exist at the time. And our parents, for the only time in their entire lives, hired a limousine because they brought along my father's sister, my aunt, and my mother's best friend, and came down to Midway, and then we drove back to Milwaukee, where I grew up. So my twin brother and I were adopted to Milwaukee, Wisconsin. We grew up there our entire childhood. Our adoptive father was Norwegian American, and our adoptive mother was German American. And our mother's family, extended family, her relations, mostly all lived in the Milwaukee area. So we were surrounded by German American relatives. The area that we grew up in, near the airport in Milwaukee on the far south side, was 99.9% white. And I like to say that in the junior high and high school that I went to, most people were German and Polish, and half of them had German surnames and half had Polish surnames. So names like Schmidt and Sikorsky were the most common. And of course, this was in the 1960s and early 1970s in Milwaukee. So it was a long time ago. There was virtually no consciousness around race. The way I like to describe it is that basically I grew up feeling like a Martian who had arrived from outer space in a spaceship. And years later, when I met other adoptees, it was like happening upon a convention of Martians and spaceships. But I suppose most of my identity was around my family, school, the usual markers for identity. We grew up in a very religious household. We were raised Lutheran, and my parents were very devout. We went to church every Sunday. I would say I was accepted socially within the church community. Later on, I found that to be too narrow a community for myself, but it was nurturing in its way. The most nurturing elements of my school life really were around music. We had a very intensive involvement in classical music, took piano and violin, played in orchestras. One year I was in the jazz ensemble. And also we were in a gifted program, which was really great because in that smaller environment, everyone knew us and we were better accepted. So I had the great fortune of having very loving parents and loving grandparents. And my grandparents lived with us growing up. My grandfather died when we were 4 years old, but my grandmother was with us until we were 16, and then she eventually went into a nursing home. And she was someone who was born in 1888, which is amazing, and had this incredible sense of history, that was wonderful too. So by and large, I would say if there were any expectations, the social expectations would be probably that we would stay in the community, both in terms of staying in Milwaukee and staying embedded in the particular culture that we were growing up in, which was Northern European immigrant, mainline conservative Protestant. And ultimately, I broke away from all of that. So I had a very good childhood, I would say, but I certainly experienced a lot of social marginalization and isolation, as did so many in my generation in the first wave of Korean adoption. And it really took me many years to sort out and sift through what my childhood was about, what that experience was, and to come to a racial consciousness, because just as our entire society was backward, if I may say, in terms of race and racial identity. Certainly, in my own childhood, there was no vocabulary, there were no concepts, and even though I grew up in a very loving family and a loving extended family, and that was a great blessing, the larger society was very racist, and I was experiencing race every day, but I had no frame of reference to really understand it. And it wasn't until I was an adult that I began to sort through what my experience had been. But overall, I would have to say I had a happy childhood. My two greatest aspirations, one of them ended up being successful and the other a failure. The failure was that I wanted to be like everyone else, and that completely did not work out. The success was that I wanted to escape, and that worked out. So even though, as I say, I had a very loving home and loving parents, I just knew that for my own emotional and intellectual survival, I needed to get away. So ultimately, both my brother and I went away to college and ended up at the University of Wisconsin-Madison undergrad. And that was a great experience. So just before my 18th birthday, both my twin brother and I went off to the University of Wisconsin-Madison. We left Milwaukee, where we had grown up. We were on scholarship, which was very fortunate. For me, going away to college was a completely mind-blowing experience, mostly in the good sense. I really, growing up, knew that I needed to leave. I could not be an adult in Milwaukee and could not go through adulthood in the cultural milieu that I grew up in. So even though Madison is a smaller city, it's a big college town, and for the very first time there was some diversity. Not a lot at the beginning, because in 1978 it was still pretty darn white. But there were people of color. There were a small number of Asians. At first, they were mostly those Chinese scholars who wore blue shirts and blue pants and rode bikes everywhere, but that was something. And I began to meet Asian adults. At the same time, when I was 18, when I was a freshman, just after my 18th birthday, actually, I realized that I was gay. So I came out as a gay person. And of course, obviously, that was a very big deal too. And I have been a very content gay person for all these years since then. So going away to college, obviously I was learning a lot academically, but in terms of my life, my horizons were expanding dramatically. And I began to realize it was really the beginning of my journey towards self-racialization. Like most transracial adoptees who grew up back then, I grew up with almost zero racial consciousness, and no one gave me any. So I had to figure it out for myself. So I began to figure things out. I also realized that I needed to go to a larger city. And I ended up, I applied to a number of graduate schools, and I was accepted at the Medill School of Journalism at Northwestern University, which is, a very well-respected school. So I came down to Chicago, and when I was 21, and it was a wonderful decision. It was really one of the best decisions I made in my life. So for the first time, I was in a very large city. It was very diverse, and I was really beginning to make my way as a fledgling person of color in the world. I began to identify myself as Asian American. I made my very first tentative connections with a tiny bit of Korean culture or Korean American culture. This was really still before most people had the internet, so still the olden days. And so there was a lot that came to me later on. But the most important thing was, as a young adult, I began to realize that I could create my own identity. And one of the things I said in a lot of public forums, I've been very involved with the CON conference for 13 years now, and it's a conference that's oriented around Korean adoption. It stands for Korean American Adoptee and Adoptive Family Network. And there's an annual conference held every year in the summer. And I've said this at the CON conference and in other forums. For me, the journey of being a transracial adoptee and the journey of being a gay person are actually very similar, psychologically and spiritually, at least in my own personal experience. In both cases, they involve really having to construct an identity on one's own, hopefully with help and support from others. But unlike most people, I really had no map in either case. And then, of course, there's the complexity of being a gay person of color. So you get a lot of overlap of journeys and complexity around that. But going back to being on my own for the first time at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, I suddenly realized that I could be who I wanted to be. And even though I had grown up with very loving parents in a supportive personal environment, not so much the broader society, but a supportive family environment, there had been no concepts or vocabulary for self-racialization, for identity. And it's taken me many years to become fully self-racialized, meaning to come to my own consciousness about what it means to be a person of color. Back in the undergraduate and graduate school days, I still had not met many adoptees. So that was to come years later. But I was beginning to meet people of color and beginning to realize that the frames of reference that I had lived with as a child really made absolutely zero sense for me as an adult in my adult life. I tried to learn as much as I could academically as well. I remember doing a paper in graduate school on the internment of Japanese Americans during World War II. And even though I was Korean American, that was one of the few things I could find in history books that was readily accessible to me and understandable to me as an Asian American. So I remember doing that paper and thinking, this is interesting. This actually speaks to me as a person. And what spoke to me most about doing that one paper on that one subject was understanding that I was viewing things as an Asian American, that I was no longer viewing things through a white lens. Because one of the most fundamental challenges for transracial adoptees is figuring out how to frame their experiences through race. And for those of us in the first wave of Korean adoption, I don't know anyone, and I don't want to speak for others, but I haven't met anyone who had a situation in which they were given a frame of reference that was racialized. Everybody's had to figure it out for themselves, including myself. So it's been a great journey that way, and I've learned so much. But the real beginning of my coming to consciousness was in my college years. The South Koreans view us, I think, this is my interpretation, as being a part of the tribe, but kind of in some distant outer ring of the tribe, and not a very well accepted ring either. After I went there in 2002, I came up with a concept, and no one actually said this to me directly, but I put it together based on a large number of conversations with Koreans in South Korea, that they view us as something like broken vessels. We are Korean by blood, and they're obsessed with the blood, so the genetic link is there. But we don't think like Koreans, we don't act like them, we don't actually look like them. We have different styles. We don't speak the language, and we completely are not embedded in the culture, and therefore we have completely different cultural assumptions. So it's been a fascinating experience, and I think I very strongly urge any Korean adoptee who is interested to go visit, but I also immediately advise them that if they think that it's going to be an easily integrated experience, they should think again. Or as one adoptee said at a conference session, I thought that by going to South Korea, I would be able to put all my puzzle pieces together, but I just ended up with more puzzle pieces. So as of the moment of this taping, I'm 53 years old. I've been very fortunate. I have a very nice career. I'm a journalist. I'm a healthcare journalist. I've been a professional journalist for 32 years, and I love that. I'm fortunate that I have been in a lifetime partnership for 28 years, and that's been wonderful. I have a daughter who just turned 12, which is great too. I chose to have a child with a friend of mine and co-parent, so it's an unusual situation. But it is fascinating to be a biological parent and to be an adoptee. So one of the concepts that I've been talking about a lot, and that actually came up and was suggested by an adoptee who was born in India at a meeting called the International Adoptee Congress that took place about 11 years ago, was the concept of the narrative burden. It's something we all carry with us. It's the who are you, what are you, why are you here, what does all this mean thing. And it's the burden that is foisted on people like us to explain ourselves and explain our identities. And one of the great satisfactions for me has been sharing concepts like that with fellow adoptees so they can better grasp their situations and decide how to handle situations, adoptive parents, etc. So it's a great journey. And I think that when there are opportunities for all of us to get together and talk, we learn a lot from each other and we support each other. So that's been very satisfying.